They called him useless. They whispered behind the tall glass walls of his home that he was nothing but a disappointment. Yet none of them knew that this boy, this fragile, bright soul, would one day stand between his family and an unspeakable betrayal. His name was Ethan Coleman, and at 17 he already carried scars deeper than most men twice his age. The Coleman estate stretched like a monument to power. Iron gates opened to manicured lawns. Fountains danced in the sunlight, and every corner of the mansion seemed designed to impress. At the very center of this world was Adrian Coleman, a billionaire whose name echoed in boardrooms from New York to London. He had built an empire with brilliance and relentless drive. And in his heart, he believed his son Ethan was meant to inherit more than wealth, heir to both legacy and vision. But Ethan was not the heir people expected. While others pictured the son of a tycoon playing polo or shaking hands with investors, Ethan's joy lived in colors, fabrics, and sketches. He loved the sound of scissors slicing through cloth, the way a thread could turn ordinary fabric into something extraordinary. He preferred the shine of sequins to the glare of stadium lights, the soft rhythm of a sewing machine to the roar of a football crowd. To Adrian, none of that mattered. His love for his son was unwavering, though distance often weakened its presence. Work swallowed him whole, flights and meetings keeping him far from the house that echoed with silence when he was gone. And in that silence, a darker force thrived. Olivia, Adrian's second wife, carried herself like perfection personified. She smiled at galas, offered her shoulder at charity events, and held Ethan close when the cameras flashed. But behind those velvet curtains, behind the champagne glasses and polite applause, her mask slipped. To her, Ethan was not a son. He was a problem, a flaw in the immaculate image she worked so hard to build. In her eyes, he was the eccentric boy who would stain the Coleman name with whispers of being too soft, too different, too much. Ethan felt her contempt in every narrowed glance, every word that cut sharper than scissors. She never needed to shout, a smirk at his sketches, a raised eyebrow at his choice of clothes, the way her voice dripped with disdain when she told him he would never be a real man. Those small daggers bled him slowly, but he refused to let them steal the spark inside. At school, the ridicule was relentless. His classmates mocked the way he dressed, the way his hands moved when he spoke, the way his eyes lingered too long on things they deemed unworthy of a boy. Yet even in that cruelty, Ethan found fragments of resilience. He stitched beauty from rejection, layering defiance into every design he created in secret. He knew he was different, and though the world branded that difference as weakness, he began to sense it was his truest strength. Still, the walls at home offered no comfort. When Adrian was away, Ethan lived inside a fortress that felt more like a cage. Olivia's words haunted him in empty hallways. She painted herself as a mother to the outside world. Yet in the quiet of the mansion, she carved away at his spirit, reminding him again and again that he was unwanted. And yet, even with the weight of her cruelty pressing down, Ethan held to one belief: that his father's pride in him was real, that he was not the failure she wanted him to believe. Adrian often told the press that Ethan would inherit not only his fortune, but his mind. "My son will continue the Coleman legacy," he declared with a smile that seemed to carry both love and certainty. Ethan clung to those words like a lifeline, replaying them when the nights grew heavy with doubt. This was the boy they mocked, the son they dismissed, but destiny was weaving something far larger than ridicule. What Olivia never understood was that difference can be dangerous to those who live only for appearances. Ethan's courage to exist outside the mold would one day ignite a chain of events no one could stop. In his quiet defiance, a lesson was already unfolding. When the world tries to erase what makes you unique, sometimes the only act of survival is to hold it closer, to let it burn brighter. Ethan did not yet know it, but his strength would soon be tested in ways he could never have imagined. And the mask Olivia wore so carefully was already beginning to crack. If you believe stories like Ethan's deserve to be told, make sure to follow Heart Story, where every tale reminds us that being true to who we are can change everything. In the grand halls of the Coleman estate, light spilled across marble floors and chandeliers sparkled, as though they had trapped entire galaxies. From the outside, the family appeared untouchable, the perfect portrait of wealth and grace. Yet beneath the shine of crystal and polished silver, a quiet war was unfolding, one that Adrian Coleman could not see. Olivia moved through this world as if it belonged to her. With every calculated gesture, she mastered the art of performance. At charity galas, she placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder, pulling him close for photographers. At fundraising dinners, she whispered praise about her wonderful stepson, all while smiling as if they shared a bond. She laughed lightly when Adrian spoke proudly of Ethan's creativity, nodding for the crowd to see. And in those moments, guests would leave believing that the Colemans were a family united by love. But when the doors shut and the cameras dimmed, the cruelty began. Olivia's voice would shift, cutting like ice. "You'll never carry this family's name with pride," she would mutter when no one else was near. She reminded Ethan of his difference not as something rare or beautiful, but as a flaw, a stain she longed to erase. Her words were knives wrapped in silk, striking deep because they were spoken not in rage but in disdain. Ethan's refuge, his father, was too often absent. Adrian's empire demanded constant travel, board meetings in faraway cities, and late nights filled with contracts and negotiations. He saw only fragments of his son's world. When he returned, he witnessed Olivia's staged warmth and believed the lie. He saw his wife's arm draped gently across Ethan's shoulders, her eyes sparkling with false tenderness. He saw photographs that suggested harmony, never realizing that behind them lay poison. Ethan endured in silence. At school, the torment followed him like a shadow. Classmates sneered at the way he dressed, mocking the bright colors and tailored designs he created with care. They tossed cruel words casually, as if teasing were sport and his identity the ball. On the walk home, laughter trailed behind him like chains. And yet, the house was worse. In those long evenings without his father, Ethan climbed the stairs with dread. Olivia waited with her polished smile sharpened into something darker. She ridiculed him for his love of sewing, mocked the way his hands trembled when he spoke of art, and declared he would never become a man worthy of the Coleman name. She feared not only his difference, but the way Adrian celebrated it. For each time Adrian declared, "My son will inherit my legacy," Olivia's resentment deepened. It burned quietly, like embers hidden beneath ash, waiting for the chance to blaze. Ethan learned to guard his spirit. He retreated to his room where sketches lined the walls, a private gallery of who he truly was. Threads and fabric filled his desk, small pieces of himself stitched into each creation. There, in the hum of the sewing machine and the vivid colors spread across paper, he found a fragment of safety. He stitched away the cruel words, weaving defiance into each design, reminding himself that identity could be armor if he refused to surrender it. Still, the longing for his father's presence ached. Adrian's words of pride were like lanterns in the dark, but lanterns could not banish the cold. Ethan wondered how much longer he could withstand the storm alone. Olivia's hostility was no longer a passing cruelty, it had become an obsession. With each smile she wore in public, she rehearsed her disguise, polishing it until even Adrian could not see the cracks. And as the months passed, her hatred sharpened into something more dangerous. She no longer sought just to belittle the boy. She began to imagine erasing him altogether, believing the family's future would shine brighter if Ethan simply vanished. Ethan did not yet know how close the shadow of that thought had drawn, but every cutting remark, every staged embrace, was tightening the web around him. The house that once felt cold was slowly becoming a trap. There is a truth that life often teaches: quietly, cruelty does not always roar. Sometimes it smiles. And for those who live beneath it, survival depends on recognizing the mask before it is too late. Ethan was beginning to see through the mask Olivia wore, but the danger of knowing would soon test him in ways that no child should ever have to face. The Coleman mansion stood quiet that evening, too quiet for a house built to host grand celebrations. The staff had been dismissed early, leaving only the echo of footsteps across the polished floors. In the dining room, Olivia oversaw the preparations with an intensity that unsettled even the servants. The silverware gleamed under candlelight, crystal glasses sparkled, and a single bowl of soup steamed gently in front of the seat reserved for Ethan. Adrian was away, traveling again, lost in the endless rhythm of his empire. That absence emboldened Olivia. For months she had allowed her resentment to simmer, concealed beneath her polished facade. Now, with no one to interrupt, she saw her chance to end what she viewed as the threat to her perfect life. Every movement was deliberate, the measured pour of wine, the gentle ladle dipping into the pot, the powder slipping unnoticed into the golden broth. Ethan descended the staircase slowly, his fingers trailing along the carved banister. He had learned to expect ridicule in Olivia's presence. But that night, something felt different. The house hummed with unease. At the table, Doyle, Olivia smiled with practiced charm, beckoning him forward. Her tone was sweet, but her eyes betrayed a hunger that made Ethan's chest tighten. He sat down, staring at the soup placed carefully before him. Steam curled into the air, carrying a scent that should have promised comfort, yet made him recoil. Olivia urged him to eat, her words wrapped in false warmth, her hands folded neatly as if awaiting a performance. Ethan lifted the spoon, his hand trembling, but the weight of her gaze pressed against him like a shadow. He lowered it again. In that moment, his instinct screamed. Ethan had lived too long under her roof not to recognize danger disguised as care. The sharpness in her eyes, the faint curl of satisfaction at the corners of her lips. These were not the expressions of a mother, not even a stepmother struggling to pretend. They were the eyes of someone who wanted him gone. His throat burned with unspoken fear, but something deeper pushed against the silence. Tears welled as he confronted her, not in whispers but in raw defiance. His voice cracked, yet carried a power he had never allowed himself to release. I know you hate me. I know you wish I didn't exist, but I will not disappear just because you want me to. The words pierced the room, shattering the fragile disguise Olivia had crafted for years. Her expression twisted, rage flashing across her face before she could contain it. She leaned forward, urging him again, insisting he eat. But the mask had slipped too far. For the first time, Ethan saw her not as a tormentor hidden behind kindness, but as an enemy revealed. The confrontation erupted with a force years in the making. Ethan pushed the bowl away, tears streaming, his body shaking under the weight of terror and courage colliding. The soup spilled across the white tablecloth, staining it with proof of his resistance. Olivia's composure cracked into fury. Her voice no longer sweet, but venomous. She hissed words of contempt, but before she could strike deeper, a sound broke the storm. The front doors opened. Heavy footsteps echoed through the hall. Adrian Coleman, expected home days later, had returned without warning. His presence filled the room before he even entered. He stepped into the dining hall, his eyes catching the scene in an instant, his son in tears. The soup splattered across the table, and his wife frozen in shock. For a heartbeat, silence hung heavy, the kind that precedes revelation. Ethan rushed forward, collapsing into his father's arms, the truth pouring out with hopes he had held back for years. Adrian's embrace tightened as realization dawned, his gaze hardening as he looked at Olivia. That night, a secret no longer remained hidden. The mask that had defined their household had been torn away, and Ethan, trembling but unbroken, had chosen to protect his life by daring to speak. There is a lesson buried in moments like these. Silence may shield cruelty, but courage unmasks it. When a child finds the strength to say, "I will not vanish," the world is forced to hear the truth, even if it arrives in tears at a dinner table meant to destroy them. The dining room, once arranged for elegance, had collapsed into chaos. Candlelight flickered over the spilled soup, casting shadows that made the walls themselves seem to tremble. Ethan clung to Adrian with a desperation born of years of silence. His words poured out in broken fragments, each syllable heavy with pain. He spoke of insults whispered in hallways, of ridicule masked behind smiles, of a pattern of cruelty hidden carefully from the world, and now of poison stirred into the meal meant to end his life. Adrian held his son tighter, his jaw set with a fury Ethan had never seen before. The man who had conquered industries now faced a betrayal inside his own home. He turned toward Olivia, his voice low yet searing. He demanded the truth not through accusations, but through the cold weight of evidence. The bowl was lifted away, carried swiftly by staff, and within hours the test confirmed what Ethan already knew. The broth had been laced with poison. Olivia's composure cracked like glass. Her perfect posture faltered. Her painted smile vanished, and the mask she had worn for years dissolved. She tried to speak, to twist the story as she always had, but this time no lie could hold. The results stood undeniable, as damning as the fear still etched on Ethan's face. Confronted, Olivia trembled, her words stumbling into excuses. She claimed stress, misunderstanding, anything but intent. Yet the weight of the evidence bore down like iron. Adrian's eyes no longer softened toward her. They burned with betrayal, not only for the attempt on his son's life, but for the deception woven into every embrace she had faked, every dinner she had staged, every gesture meant to blind him. Ethan stepped forward then, wiping his tears, refusing to be hidden behind his father's shadow. His voice was steadier than before, carried by the fire that had been ignited in him. I will not let anyone erase me, not for being who I am, not for refusing to fit into their mold. He looked not only at Olivia, but at the lawyers now present, the staff who lingered in shock, and even at his father, as though declaring to the world itself. Adrian's face softened only when he turned back to his son. In Ethan's strength, he saw not fragility, but resilience, the very essence of legacy he had always spoken of. His hand rested firmly on Ethan's shoulder, signaling to all present that his loyalty lay firmly with the boy they had underestimated. Olivia, cornered by the truth, could no longer wield the weapon of appearances. Without her mask, she stood exposed, a woman undone by envy, consumed by her own performance, revealed not as a gracious wife, but as a would-be destroyer of the very family she pretended to uphold. The air was thick with silence, the kind that carries lessons no words can fully capture. For Ethan, this night was no longer about survival alone. It was about claiming dignity, refusing the identity of a victim, and declaring his right to live authentically. For Adrian, it was the awakening to a truth he had overlooked for too long. Love must be active, not passive, and blindness in the name of trust can leave the most vulnerable unprotected. In that room of spilled soup and shattered lies, the battle was no longer hidden. It was fought in the open, and Ethan had emerged not as the boy no one wanted, but as the young man who forced the truth to the surface. Life often teaches its hardest lessons through the cruelty of others, yet the strength to stand, to speak, to declare one's worth even in the face of betrayal, becomes the shield that no poison can penetrate. Ethan had found that strength, and it had saved not only himself but the legacy his father had once feared might be lost. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Coleman estate, casting a pale glow over a house that no longer felt the same. The grandeur remained, but the illusions had been stripped away. Where once Olivia's false warmth had filled the silence, now only truth lingered. And with truth came the unveiling of what Adrian Coleman had long prepared in secret. The family lawyer arrived, carrying a folder thick with documents. Olivia sat pale, her eyes darting with panic, clinging to the last hope that wealth might shield her from disgrace. She believed that if Adrian turned away from her, she could still hold power through inheritance. But the papers told a different story. Adrian unfolded the will before them all, his voice steady with both authority and love. The estate, the empire, the fortune, every part of it was written for Ethan. Yet more than the money, the document revealed something greater. Adrian had established the Coleman Pride Foundation, a trust dedicated to protecting young people like his son, those who had been cast aside, ridiculed, or silenced simply for living true to themselves. He spoke of it with reverence, explaining how Ethan's courage had inspired him, How a boy mocked as useless had become the reason for a legacy of compassion and strength. Olivia's face crumbled. The empire she had coveted was not only beyond her reach, but transformed into a beacon that denied everything she stood for. Her manipulation had ended not in triumph, but in humiliation. Even had Ethan fallen to her scheme, she would have gained nothing. The very inheritance she sought was locked behind the bravery of the boy she despised. Ethan listened in silence, tears gathering, not of fear, but of release. He understood then that his life was more than survival. It was testimony. His father's wealth might protect him, but the greater inheritance was something no one could measure: the validation that his difference was not weakness, but strength. The foundation bearing his name was proof that what the world tried to shame could be transformed into power that healed others. He rose from his chair, shoulders no longer weighed down by shame. He walked through the mansion not as the boy who once hid in sketchbooks, but as someone who had forced truth into the light and found that it did not destroy him. It set him free. For the first time, the world seemed to expand before him, limitless, waiting for the mark he would leave. In time, people would look at Ethan Coleman and see not the insults of his youth, but the courage of a young man who had stood tall against cruelty. He would become a symbol for others like him, a reminder that no attempt to erase authenticity could succeed when faced with resilience. And so the house that once echoed with ridicule now echoed with something stronger: conviction. Ethan stepped into that conviction with a quiet strength that promised to outlast wealth, fame, and betrayal. His legacy was no longer tied only to his father's empire, but to every young person who would one day find shelter in the foundation built from his story. Sometimes the bravest act is simply refusing to disappear. Ethan had chosen to exist loudly, defiantly, and truthfully. In doing so, he had transformed not only his own life, but the very future of his family's name. Do you believe courage to live authentically can truly change the course of an entire family? Share your thoughts below. I want to hear your voice. And if this story touched you, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Heart Stories, where stories of truth and resilience find the light they deserve.